Today, we are going to focus on risk. So on our agenda, we're going to start with John Miller to talk about financial and operational risks. Joe Cashin from Harder Sechrist is going to talk about governance considerations and risk management. Karen Lynch is going to talk about student financial aid update. Brendan Horton from our Fox Point security team is going to talk about cybersecurity. And then Kyle Crosley and Julie Coopers, sorry, is going to talk about health plan risk management. And as we move through the morning today, we're going to start by doing a brief presentation from each speaker, and then we're going to do a Q&A session after a short break. So please put any questions that you have in the chat. For those people who are in person, we will just open it up to questions. Please speak loudly so that the mics pick up any questions for the remote attendees. But with that, I will turn it over to John and get the presentation started.
All right. So I am going to try to shrink. No. Let's try this.
Yeah.
There. No.
Now you look like
How about it's in the tool man?
there you go. That's
All right, so I will stay hunched over, but we do have our IT coming to put the tracking on the camera, so not everyone has to stay hunched over. So before we get started, a couple things with Joe and the introduction. Come in. Yep. Joe and the introduction. Also would like to thank the Upstate New York College Collaborative for assisting us with putting this on. There's a lot of back and forth, especially as we talk about ideas and what should we be presenting on and bringing those ideas. Again, those ideas come from the group. So if there's ever, hey, can you guys speak on this or a presentation on this would be helpful, please let us know. Also, I would like to say, I believe this is actually our 10th year of doing this. So we've completed a decade. So that is pretty impressive. I see Gene in the back. This was one of Gene's brainchilds about doing this. So it's good to see that it is continued for 10 years, and while that 10 years goes by pretty quickly. So as Joe mentioned, I get the navigating financial and operational risks in higher ed. So we'll start off with a polling question first. Again, those that are online or even in the room, you hit the QR code, but what is the biggest obstacle to your board's effectiveness right now? I am a board chair, rolling off one and coming on to a board chair for the other one. I don't know how I get selected for this stuff, but I can say every single one of those is something we're talking about at governance. So there's definitely no wrong answer. And I love being live. I get to actually see a face in the room, react to that. So I'll give a couple minutes to scan it in. Again, if you're having problems with it, what we can do is just put something in the group chat or group. No, not the group chat, the chatting section, and Duran will see it. Also, as Joe mentioned, we will have a moderated panel. So again, put those questions in that chat as well, and we can hopefully see them. Well, we will see them, but hopefully be enough time to respond to those. All right, so risks to financial and operations sustainability. So I get to talk about financial and operational sustainability to a group of business officers and controllers, and mainly business officers and controllers. So I will be a lot of Captain Obvious. Yes, John, we know that to be true. But again, it's good to reiterate some of these comments. So really how we look at this is it starts at tuition dependency, or what I would say enrollment dependency. And then the other side of that is your operational cost, and that all goes in. Tuition dependency, what that really means is that your enrollment is driving over 60% of your revenue. Most of the institutions we work with, it's probably about at least 75 to 80%. And I know there's some folks at community colleges or ancillary entities, and they'll say, oh, well, we got the public funding. I'd remind you to think about your state aid and how that's enrollment dependent as well. So really with tuition dependency, we got to think about our enrollment. If we think about upstate New York or the Northeast in general, and we have changing demographics, the birth rates are going down. That is something we can't really control. We can't control. Affordability and value. Really, since the Great Recession about 15 years ago, a lot of folks have questioned, is there value in a higher education? To me, there definitely is. I will talk to people who'll say, well, you got a very specific accounting degree. And I will talk about, you know what I use on more of a daily basis? It's not my T accounts. It's my liberal arts degree. and having to critically think through problems and challenges. But a lot of folks are questioning that based on what the cost is. We have academic offerings, they're old, are these the same ones that not only I was taking, but my parents are taking as well? And really the students these days, they want the new, they want what's fresh. They want to be what Brendan's going to talk about with AI and cybersecurity. That's cool. They want to see the data, and they're actually questioning, hey, this is what I want. I want something fresh. I don't want to drive the Buick like my grandfather did. And then we have other competition, and it's not just amongst yourselves, saying we're competing with ourselves. You're also competing with what I'll call indirect competition. We have students now saying, I'm going to take that gap year. So you're competing against that. They're saying, you know what, I want to go do something cool and experience it while getting an education. So I'm going to go to Croatia and go get educated there. And Joe gave a grin. I hope are your kids thinking that or something?
Occasionally.
Okay.
Yeah.
But you're also competing too. You're also competing too, like just in town in Rochester, we have the Golisano Business Institute. You're competing with that. So there's more, that pie that's getting smaller with the birth rates is now being split in more ways. Cost structure. And I've talked about this over the years. Your cost structure is really in higher ed is 90% fixed. It's really tough as your revenue is variable to go up and down with your fixed costs. But now we have new costs, and a lot of those are the operational challenges as well. And as I said, cybersecurity, we got that new cost. We got AI, we got more data, we got more information that we got to do things with. We have students that need to be taught differently. They need additional student services. All that comes as a new cost. And even though we've come through a period of high inflation, it looks like it's coming back down. But the reality is we're never going to have a period of deflation. That's just not going to happen. So our fixed costs that we had, our original cost structure, not going anywhere. And what that's doing is that's putting pressure on our ability to service our debt. A lot of our debt was entered into when our enrollment rates were at a certain point. We said, hey, as long as we do that, relatively, we price it like this, we'll cover our debt. Well, now enrollment's coming down, operating costs are going up, pressure on our debt service. And then it goes to capital. And students these days expect the most up-to-date capital, up-to-date equipment, up-to-date facilities, up-to-date technology. Where's the cash coming to invest in that? Where's the debt capacity that we can do that? A lot of things we got to think about. And then operational, I kind of already touched on that. But out of all of that comes your risk of financial viability and operational sustainability. So, how do we manage this? A lot of this is kind of, again, John's Captain Obvious. We can Google this, we can figure this out, but kind of, we'll put it here. The first thing to managing your risks is you got to admit you have risk. You got to identify them. What are all the risks? Sit around, whether it's in a group, whether you have a risk committee, whether it's part of your governance structure, but identify those risks. Then you analyze them, you score them, you think about what could ultimately happen to those risks. So, you'll sit around the room and you'll say, okay, if enrollment continues to go down, what is the risk to us? Where's the risk? Where's the risk if we continue to do this program? Where's the risk if we don't address cybersecurity and do penetration testing? Where's the ultimate risk if we don't adopt AI and we're not one of the early adopters? You kind of score those risks and you think about them. The next step after you analyze them and you score them is now you got a plan. How are you going to address those risks? Some of it is strategic planning. Some of it's just relative planning. Like, I don't think anyone's making a strategic choice that we're not going to address a cybersecurity risk. I really don't. But you still got a plan to do it. Where you are making a strategic choice is, what are we going to do with our programs? Are we going to continue the same old programs to address our financial risk? What are we going to do related to our debt capacity? How are we going to address that? That's kind of more of those strategic choices. So we go from planning to now we got to manage the risk. Manage the risk means we implement it. We put in programs to address it. If you think a way to financial sustainability is through an early retirement incentive, now we got to manage that. We got to implement, we got to manage it. If you think the key to cybersecurity is we do penetration testing, we got to do the penetration testing. So then we can we implement and manage it. And then lastly, we got to monitor. So anything worth doing is worth measuring, and that's how we monitor it. Whether it's through KPIs, whether it's through how many times did we do this, we at least got to monitor it, and we monitor it, whether it's at, an internal employee level, subcommittee level, or governance level. When we address these risks, we got to see how they're doing. And then my last slide is kind of review the opportunities in your risk, your risk profile. Going clockwise, starting at the beginning, understanding trends in the environment. So you as business officers, you have a responsibility to understand your risk. How do you do that? You educate yourself by attending today, being part of Nakubo, going to those events, reading your daily news briefs that hit your emails at 5 o'clock in the morning. You got to educate yourself. Then you got to bring that back to your senior leadership. You have to bring that back to your governance and educate them on the risks. You have to align governance. And I think Joe might go on a little bit into that at the governance structure, but we all got to be, you have to be in alignment. You have to say, here's what the risks are. Here's where we're going to address, here's how we're going to address it. And make sure you all speak with one voice, because if you're not, something could go astray. Financial forecasts and multi-year budgets. Again, a way to address risks is you got to know what your baseline is. You got to say, if we were to do nothing and enrollment would continue at this trend and costs would continue at this trend, what does it look like in 5 years? What does it look like if we can start doing a what if analysis, or we kind of start doing a multi-year budget and work our way back into it? I have seen some of you really start to employ some of those strategies, so that's good. We're moving there. And then diversify revenue streams. I mean, that's just kind of like your finance 101. Well, obviously, if you're tuition dependent, become less tuition dependent. It's not as easy as hitting the light switch. I recognize that. But part of it is to think about that risk. How can you utilize what your assets are? You know, we think assets like, how do we utilize our buildings? Okay, maybe could we utilize our buildings to do something different? But also remember your higher ed. You have smart people. You have intellectual knowledge. Maybe there's a way you could utilize that to diversify your revenue streams. So with that, that's my probably 5 to 10 minutes. I'm going to turn it over to Joe. He's going to come up. I thought they would have figured out the thing, but you get to hunch over a little bit too.
Okay. Thank you, John.
Yeah.
Okay. Good morning, everybody. Thanks to Bonadio and the rest of my fellow speakers for letting me join you this morning. I'm going to talk about governance that John alluded to. And what we want to consider, think about, understand, and be able to frame when you're working through the various risk items that John talked about. I do this presentation in what some people might consider out of order. Usually when people talk about governance, they start with fiduciary duties, and then I see everybody's head go like this. People generally know what those fiduciary duties are, but I like to start with what the relative roles and responsibilities of the board and management are, so that the right groups of people are doing the right things and making the right decisions. So if those decisions go wrong, the board or the management team is protected and people are staying in their lane. The biggest risk area I see in governance is when, frankly, folks get outside of their role. So what is the board's role? It is supporting the institution, making sure the mission is at the focus of their work, monitoring and the overall performance of the institution and the chief executive, the president. It's not running the place. And you see boards at different levels sometimes get a little bit too far into the weeds. But it's focusing on that larger strategy, making sure resources are being available and accounted for, assuring overall operational responsibility, monitoring your own performance. You know, one of the board's biggest jobs is assessing itself. How is it doing? How is it doing in all of these things? Evaluating and supporting the chair, selecting the right officers, selecting your right leaders, and the president, and otherwise being an ambassador advocating for the institution. Those are the board's jobs. There are things that, of course, overlap with management. The most effective boards that I see are collaborative with management in all of the areas that I talk about. But the board understands, and they should be mutually supporting. They should improve each other. But you know, the ones that I see that are not successful and are implicating risk are boards that are a little withdrawn, a little too quiet, or at the other end of the spectrum, a little too meddling. So here's what the board has to do. And to distinguish it and think about it in a Venn diagram, this is the board circle. There's the management circle, and then there's the overlapping area. So the things that the board has to do, if you change your corporate purposes, if you add degrees, if you add programs, the board has to approve that. It cannot be done without the board. Anything governance related, the board has to approve that. Certain regulatory reporting, the board has to be involved. The board has to be involved in audits. The board has to be involved in any major decisions, major corporate transactions, and of course, the board has to select the leader and president. There are a lot of examples that we could go through in terms of what is a major corporate transaction and things like that, but I think people have a sense that if it's a big enough thing that is being talked about and anybody has a question in mind of whether or not we should involve the board, you probably should. The board should probably have a voice in that decision. Contrasting what the board's responsibilities are with management's responsibilities, I put up a couple of slides here on what management is responsible for. What is the president responsible for? Everything and everybody, every personnel decision. Of course, some of those decisions are delegated to HR or to academic departments or things like that, subject to tenure. But the president is in charge of those personnel decisions. The board should not be making personnel decisions other than the president. Certain functional things, of course, the president has to delegate. He or she cannot do everything. The provost, the CFO, chief administrative officer, whatever the various titles are, those people report to the president, and typically they interface with the board and help support the board in its decision-making in the areas where the board needs to take action. But you'll see here again, I've emphasized that when it comes to employing people, making personnel decisions, hiring, firing, performance evaluations, determining compensation, at an individual level, the only time the board should be doing that is with respect to the president. If it's a comp plan or a comp assessment or an equitable pay study or things like that, sure, the board can get involved. Management should be leading it, but the board can get involved in that. But other than determining the president's compensation, the board should not be getting too deep. The management responsibility is to execute on those strategic things that the board set, those strategic directions that the board set, hopefully in collaboration with management. Management is responsible for executing these things. The tactics, how do we get there? How do we execute on that strategy? And then management has an obligation to report back to the board on how those things are going and whether or not they were successful. And it should be, the most successful boards I've seen are sort of in a constant feedback loop. The management team and the board are working together. The initiatives are joint. A lot of the reporting that goes on at meetings is collaborative. A lot of times the CFO and the treasurer are jointly presenting on something or sharing information. Those are the most successful boards, a good, healthy balance. So once you're in the right lane, what are your standards? Well, you have, when you're in your right lane, here's how we talked about what you're supposed to be doing. Here are the things, here are the standards to which you should be aspiring. The not-for-profit corporation law governs higher education institutions. The education law punts to the not-for-profit corporation law and sets the standards for performance expectations. We have another polling question. So we'll take a pause here. Do we get the polling results from the first one?
We used to. I think Duran has them.
Oh, okay.
But we can maybe during a little bit of the break, we can go over them.
Okay. Can I guess at the number one on the first question? I'm going to say engagement. No, I was wrong. Oh, okay. Well, that's a funny game. So polling question number 2, which of the following is considered a prime financial risk for education institutions? over-reliance on tuition, cybersecurity threats, regulatory compliance, and campus safety. Please follow the directions on the screen to provide your polling response.
You can guess.
Yeah.
You know, like, I don't know.
Yes, so Joe, actually, the question that came up on the scanner was different. As you can see, people are asking about the HERF. The questions are important, but a lot of it is just to show engagement. It's really more just to see.
That's why I cast engagement.
Yeah, so no one's not going to get CPE. We just want to see that you're answering the questions.
So when you're doing those things you're supposed to do, how are you supposed to act? Well, there are 3 legal standards: your duty of care, duty of loyalty, and duty of obedience. The first one comes from the not-for-profit corporation law. The second one is a combination of the Internal Revenue Code and the not-for-profit corporation law, and the last one comes from case law. What is the duty of care? Well, that you care about what you're doing. That you, yes, it's in the name. It's that you act appropriately as somebody in that position, with a degree of diligence, care, and skill that a prudent person would use in discharging that duty. I tend to rephrase it as the duty of paying attention and making informed decisions. When you get materials, when you're presented with information, digest it. Come ready, come prepared to have a professional and respectful debate and discussion about the issues. Decisions can be delegated. Decision-making can be delegated, excuse me. And so when a decision is delegated, that duty of care shifts from your own standard of acting prudently to making sure the people that you've delegated to are capable of discharging that standard and acting prudently. So it shifts to a oversight duty rather than your own duty. Here are the things that trustees have to be familiar with. I don't think this list should surprise anybody. But these are the things people need to be familiar with, be able to do to discharge that duty. Second duty, you have to have an undivided allegiance to your organization. This implicates conflicts of interest, transactions that involving related parties, and conflict of interest has such a negative connotation as it probably should, because it should set off alarms in people's minds. But there are ways to proceed with conflict of interest transactions if you define what those conflicts are. They are disclosed, they are discussed, deliberated, and documented, and then you can proceed with that transaction. But if you don't talk about it, don't identify it, you are implicating a breach of the duty of loyalty. A duty of loyalty also implicates excess benefit transactions. So this duty of loyalty covers conflicts of interest and excess compensation to executives. And this is where the Internal Revenue Code comes in. So, organizations like Bonadeo and other organizations can help with this sort of thing, making sure your executive is compensated reasonably. And you do that by using comparable data and documenting that decision. You must have a conflict of interest policy under the not-for-profit corporation law, required by law. The Internal Revenue Code suggests it, New York law requires it. And again, I have the 4 Ds here of what really is important in working through conflicts of interest. Again, the transactions that implicate conflicts can be taken on as long as you follow these procedures. Last duty of obedience. It's got a weird name. But this is a very peculiar to New York duty. It really just means that the assets of the organization have to be deployed towards the mission. There are cases out there where assets were, transitioned into private housing. It wouldn't surprise the folks on this call and in this room that most of those cases came out of New York City because there was a financial advantage to converting those assets. So you have to use your assets for your mission. So why are all these duties important? Why do we care if we meet these standards? If you meet these standards, the board meets these standards, they have volunteer immunity. They are immune from lawsuit. If these standards are followed, The organization can cloak itself in something called the business judgment. They've used good judgment. So if they are sued on that decision, making the decision to affiliate, close down an institution, big decision. If you do it to those standards and the right people are considering the right aspects of that, you have significant legal protection if you do it right. You also have the benefit of your D&O insurance. Usually an exclusion in the D&O policy is if there's a breach of fiduciary duty. So you lose all these protections if these standards are not adhered to. So that concludes my end of the presentation. Hopefully that was a helpful refresher and maybe a way of thinking about governance and risk management in a way people haven't thought of before. How about that? Hope that was caught on camera. And next, I think, is student financial aid.
Drop that, so I not drop it.
Okay.
Although I'm gonna try to sit, but of course, I'm wearing a dress. None of the gentlemen have to wear a dress, so this will be fun.
Hey, Karen, do you want to move to a lower chair and put it in front of the table?
Oh, maybe I could do that. Hold on, we're doing some physical changes here. Who's gonna do that? Sweet. That's good. I'll figure this out. Okay, that's fine. Hey, now you can see me. I'm also the shortest person here, so.
Well, maybe not.
Well, I'm the shortest person presenting.
Okay, there we go.
No.
Okay. Oh, hold on, oh no, everybody here can see me being technical. Okay, now you gotta bring up the presentation. Boy, weird, yeah. Hopefully we didn't lose all these people.
We got.
All put me in a lower chair. Okay, perfect. Thanks, Joe. All right, awesome. Sorry for a technical glitch. And of course, now I get to talk about technology in some respects. So that's fantastic. So today I'm just going to give everyone a brief HERF update. I know nobody wants to hear about HERF anymore, especially I'm in the same boat with all of you. And then I'm just going to give some updates on student financial aid, specifically with GLBA, some new 2024 requirements. And then there's always this weird auditor reporting. And I think people at your institutions are always like, why do you need this information? It's because, believe it or not, we have an actual additional reporting that we have to do. So I just wanted to kind of provide clarification around what that is. There's a polling question next. I have no idea what you're going to get asked because it would be the HERF question, but it's not because you just got that. So somebody here will have to tell me what the question is y'all see when you bring it up. What's it today? Is it Joe's question? What's it on?
It's already responded.
Oh, it says they've already responded, Duran.
It's the HERF question.
It is the HERF question? Okay. So good job. Hopefully everyone got this. So how long must an institution keep their HERF quarterly reports on their website following performance period? 2 years, they can remove them, 3 years, or forever. So you all already answered. And again, we said we're going to look at the answers during a small break we have in a few minutes. So speaking of our friend HERF, just a reminder, the calendar reporting for 2023 is open now. So you have until June 27th to get that annual reporting done. The portal is open. And then they also are going to reopen the 2022 year. So as schools are finally closing out this program and you're actually looking at how those costs have been allocated and you've maybe realized you needed to make changes based on potentially additional funding that came through, whether you got FEMA funding or other grants, and you realized you could move some of that funding you had initially put to the HERF, you can actually go back and now update your annual 2022 reporting. So I thought that was surprising and awfully very nice of them that they're realizing that this was just rolled out way too fast and making decisions in the moment might not have been as easy as they thought. So the only other comment, if you do end up deciding you need to go back and update your 2022, make sure then you also go back and update the quarter that you also will be changing to reflect that. Because essentially your 4 quarters should equal whatever you put on that annual report. And then the other thing is that related to just kind of an update for everybody and making sure everybody's hearing it. If you don't want to go through all of those pages on the department website related to HERF, that all those quarterly reports should be separate. You don't want to make sure that you don't want them to be cumulative. That make sure that it is reported and expended based on the individual HERF awards. So they all have different like sub chapters, A1 to A13, making sure they're in the right columns. There was a prescribed format for how those quarterly reports had to be named when they go on your website. So the department's very specific about this. And then this last bullet is really the one that I want to make sure everybody is aware of, which is that all of this HERF reporting needs to remain on your website for 3 years following the end of your specific performance period. So depending on most private institutions should have been June 30th, 2023. Some of the community colleges had grants that went through later in the summer, and then some actually got the additional approval extension into 2024. So this answer for performance period is unique to each of your institutions. So just make sure you're aware of when you check that final quarterly HERF report, that's the end of your performance period, and that's when your clock will start ticking. So that's kind of the update on where we are for HERF.
Quick question.
Oh, well, lots of I'm getting questions. Yes.
So for us, we took the HERF once in fiscal year 21,
Yep.
once 2021 and 22.
Yes.
So do we need to leave them all on
Yeah.
until the end of the last reporting period for 3 years?
Yeah, so hope everyone heard the question. The question was, because HERF ran from like 2020 through 2023, yes, you keep on all of those quarterly reports. All of the reporting has to remain up on the website, publicly available.
That
Health?
was my same exact question.
Oh, okay. Perfect. That was the same question. So we got that answered. So yes, it's all quarterly reports throughout the entire HERF history of receiving the funding. Okay. So next will be our friend, my next nemesis is GLVA. Hopefully Brandon's laughing at me. He's smirking, so that's good when Brandon's up for Fox Point. I apologize. I put way too much on this slide, so I'm really sorry. So this has been probably the most common finding that we have had, at least here at Bonadeo, over the past year. Last year in 2023, they very quickly threw this new, very elaborate compliance requirement in the supplement, which isn't released until May or June. And they had said, oh, well, we put it in this, email out to you in January, which still, again, only gave you maybe 6 months to put all of this in place if you weren't already doing it. So it was a very short turnaround. And unfortunately, it didn't give you a lot of time to respond. So I wanted to just go over it today. If people have questions, please ask. But essentially, the good news is the compliance supplement for 2024 is out for all of your June year-end colleges. This is the same. And then if you have a May year-end, I believe it's your first year having to qualify for the new GLBA requirements that have come out. So you did get kind of a full year to respond to this. The June 23s only had a few months. So the requirements did not change for 2024. So that's the good news. But the point here is, I've underlined a couple of key things, is that institutions are required to develop, implement, and maintain a comprehensive information security program that is written. So the key here is that you probably might be doing a lot of the things, but if, again, the government is, if it's not written, it's not documented, you don't have it. So, and it doesn't have to be in one big document. You might have many different policies that will meet these requirements, and that is acceptable as well. So the key here is that there's 7 elements that must be included in your written information security program, or your WISP. And again, going back to just informing individuals of what the findings were that I commonly would note last year is they would have policies, but they weren't approved. They were in draft. or they were copies from online documents that they pulled down and they really weren't specific to what your institution was doing. So those policies really, going to Joe's comment about, management and oversight and accountability, they really should be approved. They really should be updated. You'll see in a minute, I talk about that's one of the requirements of GLBA, but please look over those policies and procedures and make sure that they're actually final and they're updated and they're applicable to what your institution is actually doing. And then in the WISP, you need to have these 7 elements, and then there's some subsets after that. So this, like I said, is a lot. It's a big lift, and it does require a lot of, involvement across the campus. This isn't just something that one person typically can throw together. The very first thing is designated a qualified individual. So it used to be that you could have like a group of people. I know a couple of schools had groups or teams that were responsible. Now the requirement is under these new FTC safeguard rules is that you have to have one specific individual who kind of is putting themselves out there as being responsible for this program. And they're the person with essentially the ultimate responsibility for ensuring the compliance of the program. And then the other question is, or the other comment is here that you have to have a risk assessment, and this comes up all the time. Does it have to be external? They're pricey. They are pricey, but the government is expecting you to do a risk assessment annually. You can do them internally. There are some suggestions and templates online through the department's website to kind of help guide you internally, or you do them externally. My recommendation always to people is, again, it's a budgeted cost, but look at doing an external one every few years. There's something to be said about having a separate set of eyes on your program, having that additional outside look at what really should be happening and whether or not you're actually meeting the requirements. So you could always do an external one and then use that for a couple of years to kind of guide you going forward for making sure that you're providing updates and you're responding to these identified risks. I was at a conference just last week and an attorney was saying, the biggest thing he sees is people do these risk assessments and they identify, say, a top 10 or a bunch of areas are red where there's a high risk. Well, the question is, what are you doing? Are you just taking it and putting it on a shelf, or are you actually turning that into some action items and turning that into your game plan? And essentially, as an auditor, that's what I'm looking for is, okay, you did a risk assessment. You've identified a top 10. What are you doing in your budget, in your capabilities? So please understand that these things are all based on budget. Obviously, we all don't have Harvard-sized endowments and budgets to do everything, and we're not a bank. You can't afford to do what the bank has to do, but you have to be able to prove that you're considering all of these things and taking them into consideration as part of your annual plan. So then within that, you have to have 8 minimum safeguards. So the next 8 here on this slide are the safeguards that you have to demonstrate that you either have a policy for, you've considered, you've addressed, and kind of talk about what your institution is doing. So one of the first one is related to implementing and reviewing access controls. This is not just your data controls on your computer and your server. This also includes physical access. So who has access to get into the financial aid office? Who has access into the server room? It actually, if you read the language specifically, it actually says who has access to get into even the buildings specifically. Are they locked down after a certain time? How do individuals move around campus? And are you monitoring who has that access? Does it make sense that the student financial aid director went in at 9 o'clock on a Thursday night? Maybe not, but something that's part of one of the requirements is looking at not only, again, the physical, but the technological access controls. Conducting a periodic inventory of data, noting where it's collected, stored, or transmitted. This is another one. Very few colleges have done an actual full inventory. Again, where is your data? Is it on separate servers? Is it on a shelf? Is it in the basement? Is it sitting over in a nursing department because that's where you had room at some point to put a bunch of old files? But again, you need to make sure that you can identify and do regular inventories. So periodic, again, to me, typically means annually, but I understand there's constraints, as John talked about a lot with, time and energy and people. you don't necessarily have the manpower, but making sure that something is done and you can prove that you've looked at it and updated it. Encrypting your customer information on the system and when it's in transit. So again, do you have encryption? Again, I've had schools that don't have encryption yet. So this is something where I would recommend, and Brandon can probably back me up, if you're going to put money into anything, encryption would be a good thing, because you never know usually your emails internally are encrypted. But when you're talking to a parent, you're talking to a student, making sure that any of that data coming in or out of the school is being encrypted. Access apps developed by the institution. I honestly will tell you, all across the state, I haven't had anybody that does that. I don't know of anybody that has apps internally developed. So if you decide to do that, this falls under additional GLBA controls that you would need to make sure you're addressing. Multi-factor authentication, I think that is one that I would say most schools at this point do have. The department also has it on all of the access to their systems. So that one's pretty easy. Dispose of customer information securely. So there's a time constraint as well to when you dispose of customer information. From the date that you no longer need to access that data, you have 2 years to dispose of it. And how do you dispose of it? Is it paper and you have to have, the shredded people come and you shred it? How do you get it off your network? Making sure that you can document how you're timely and reasonably getting that off your system. And then anticipate and evaluate changes in the system. So again, going back to what, Joe or John are saying, when you're having significant changes in your operations, you're ending programs, you're terminating employees, or you've dropped an entire system that you were using, you've upgraded a system. All of those things need to be evaluated and updated. And then maintaining, again, a log of authorized users, making sure that you're keeping track, as I said, about who's accessing things. We have a poll question coming up, and it is, how many elements must be included in your WIS? 7, 8, 1, or 9? And then in time, keeping up with the required elements. So number 4 is that you regularly test the effectiveness. This is getting into the penetration and vulnerability assessments. John had kind of talked about those, looking and making sure you understand where some of those risks are on your campus. And then again, implementing policies to be able for your individuals to enact the actual security program. So this is the training. This was always a requirement in the old policy. It is now in the new one, which is looking at training. A lot of schools use that know before system, and just making sure that individuals are doing the training and understand if individuals are completing the training. That's another big area that we see. The training comes out, it's offered, it's something that people can typically just go on and do at their own leisure. But are they doing it? And if they don't, is there a repercussion? So going to some of the things that Joe was saying, if people aren't doing it and you have a massive data breach, and the department's going to come in and say, okay, they're going to ask for your security program, first of all. And if you can't prove that your people actually are forced to do the training and it happened because one of your teachers or students was the cause of it, that also isn't going to necessarily bode well, and then you run into insurance issues. So just making sure that there's enforcement of having this training done and making sure you can prove that individuals are held accountable to do this and what their responsibility is to the institution and the data. And then address how the institution will oversee service providers. So this includes your vendors. So any vendors that are receiving any of your data, making sure that you're looking at contracts with them. What's their system? How do they maintain the data as being safe? How are they controlling it? And making sure that they're following, or at least up to your standards. And then the last one is just responding to changes of business. So just again, this is the point of do a risk assessment and turn it into your work plan for the year, making sure you're addressing any significant changes in your environment. And then I'll go through this relatively quickly. Some new audit requirements. Again, there's a lot on the slide. I do apologize. But there's a new one related to institutional eligibility. These last 2 bullets, we will be requesting written representations from management about whether or not your institution has any of those first 4 bullets related to correspondence courses, enrollment related to the incarcerated students. This may apply to some of our community colleges. And then if you have 50% of the high school diplomas. So this is more potentially related to our community colleges as opposed to the private schools. But again, we will be asking for this, at least on our side. If you have another auditor, they will also be asking. So it is a new requirement this year that we actually get written representations from management. If you do have one of those four, we are then required to substantiate and understand how you calculate those ratios so that you're meeting these minimum requirements. And then this other one is if your institution uses a servicer or financial institution to deliver credit balances. Again, we do have some schools that outsource this responsibility to another company. And if they are doing that, there's a bunch of requirements. You have to have these contracts posted on your website. We have to go through them and review the rates that are getting charged to individuals. We have to understand individuals have the opportunity to opt out from using this system. So again, another question would start with, do you have these types of agreements? If you do, there's going to be a bunch of additional testing. If you don't, then none of this is going to apply to your institution. And then quickly, the last comment I just wanted to explain is there is an auditor reporting that we have to do. We've had to do it for a few years. And one of our portal requests is always if you can break out who gets awarded based on Pell in direct loans. So the requirement is that we have to go in and we have to explain our sample, how we make our sampling, and break it down. This is just a snip of the Pell, but the direct loan looks exactly the same. But we have to be able to support our population, which comes from you. And it's saying how many students were awarded specifically direct loans, who was provided specifically Pell, and the same thing for the return of funds. So those areas related to eligibility and disbursements and then withdrawals. That's why we kind of have these requests, at least specifically Bonadio does on our portal, and any of your auditors required to disclose this whole population and testing and sampling. And believe it or not, we do get emails back from the department. So when we file your data collection form, our contact is on there, and the department does email us and ask us if we haven't done it. So they are following up. And then, so just to understand, there is a portal request for us, and that's why your auditors need it, is because they are required to report to the department. Polling question. What is the benefit of using financial forecasts and multi-year projections in risk management for higher education? Is this your question, Brent?
It's mine.
Oh, it's John's question. Enhancing campus safety measures, anticipating future financial challenges and opportunities, improving faculty and staff training programs, or increasing student enrollment. With that, I thank you, and I will turn it over to Brandon to go through cybersecurity, which is the hot.
Thanks.
You're welcome.
I didn't get clapped for.
They barely clapped for me. They clapped for you.
All right, good morning, everyone. My name is Brendan. I'm a security analyst with Fox Point Solutions, which is our IT and cyber division of the Bonadio Group. And I know so far we had, some buzzwords going around cybersecurity, like pen testing, risk assessments, vulnerability scanning. I'll kind of touch on some of those along with some other information here. Before I really dive into some content, the cybersecurity world really loves acronyms and abbreviations. These are some of the common ones that you'll likely see if not already. So it's just good to be familiar with some of these. Jumping into our first slide here, trends from the previous year. There's a lot of different various sorts of attacks that have happened over the last year or so, but by far one of the most prevailing ones, specifically in higher education, was ransomware. And if you're not familiar with that, it's when your information or data is essentially held hostage by a criminal organization, and they request hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars to get your information back. It was a very large increase from 2022. These these statistics up here on the screen, they're only from reported ransomware attacks and where the ransom was not paid. So likely these numbers are actually much higher. You can see on the bottom right graph that, the trend was upwards from January 2022 to December 2023, which I think the highest number of attacks was June or July, capping out at about 35 attacks alone in that single month. Going over to the next graph on the other side of the screen, those are commonly known ransomware gangs. And the top one there, Lockbit, accounted for 60 of the attacks alone. And that group as a whole accounted for about 80% of all the attacks in 2023. Jumping into our first polling question, see if you took a look at some of those names on the graph. We've got, which is not a known ransomware gang, Medusa, Lockbit, LockVice, Vice Society, and Royal. Okay, so what's emerging today? We talked about ransomware in 2022, and you'll see that still up on the screen because it's still an issue. It's still happening, and it's still something that organizations and institutions need to be aware of and how they should prepare themselves if they're ever faced with, a ransomware situation. Jumping down to the next bullet point, social engineering. You've probably heard this. If you've gone through a security awareness training, social engineering is talked about pretty much every time. But it's important to recognize that social engineering tactics are getting a lot stronger. It's not as easy to figure out, what's a phishing email, a text message, is this person I'm talking to on the phone a scammer? Especially now with the introduction of artificial intelligence, right? The threat actor no longer needs to type out their email, send their text message. They can leverage AI to, mass send out, really compelling messages that won't have spelling errors. The grammar will be fine. It'll read well, which are common, talking points when you go through training to, look out for some of these items. So understanding that, emails, messages can be really compelling, and letting your employees or students know that if they're a little bit skeptical, it's better to be safe than sorry. So touched on a little bit of AI and automation with the social engineering aspect, but with the introduction of AI, it's really important that, as security vulnerabilities and different threats become aware to you, that those items get patched and remediated really timely. Because while AI can be leveraged on the defensive side of cybersecurity, to help identify some of these threats and vulnerabilities, threat actors can also use it to find those vulnerabilities before you patch them. So if you have an outdated operating system, or your financial application needs a bug update and it goes 1-2 days without being updated, that might be enough time for a threat actor to go in and exploit that vulnerability. The last two bullet points here, they kind of coincide with each other. So I think it might have been talked about a little bit already, but the last few years, a lot of organizations have transitioned from an on-premise environment to a cloud or a hybrid environment where they're no longer they no longer have a lot of infrastructure in their organization, and a lot of their data is being hosted by AWS, Google Cloud, Microsoft Azure. And I think what's important to realize is that although your information is being hosted in one of those vendors, you are still responsible for not the security, but you're responsible for that data. So what does that mean, right? You have to trust that Microsoft, that Google have strong security practices in place, and that they are going to protect your information, which leads us into that last bullet point, third-party exploitation, right? You want to be conducting vendor due diligence. You want to be requesting their assurance documentation, SOC 1, SOC 2 reports when they become available. So you can see if there's anything going on, and you can make an informed decision on whether or not this vendor is the right choice to go into business with. So AI, it's kind of it's kind of been a little bit of a buzzword. A lot of these different generative AI platforms like ChatGPT, Copilot, I think another one is Bard. They're really popular. I know they're probably super popular on college campuses right now. But I think really the bottom line with these applications is it's really important to understand and have your faculty and students understand that, no sensitive information should be shared with these platforms because they're public tools. That data can be shared amongst other people using those applications. And, ChatGPT isn't held to any sort of legal or confidentiality agreement if there's a data breach. So if you're sharing sensitive information with it, maybe you're posing a question that, you're trying to figure out, hey, I have XYZ operating system. Here are the configuration settings. What should I do to, better enhance the security of this system? Well, you just gave, all of your, secret, configuration settings, put it out there on the internet, and that could be exploited by someone if they're able to grab that information. So bottom line, don't share anything sensitive with AI platforms. And if you don't have an artificial intelligence acceptable use policy in place, that should be probably your priority number one to outline how to responsibly and ethically use AI. Jumping into some regulatory requirements, I know we've kind of touched on this a little bit and we went into detail with GLBA, but every state in the US has either a data security or a data privacy law. And I listed a few of them up here on the screen that I think are probably most applicable to our audience today. But it's really important to familiarize yourself with that law and regulation, specifically the cybersecurity requirements that it has within it, because they're similar, but there's different aspects to each, right? We talked about penetration testing, vulnerability scanning. How often do those need to be performed? They'll likely be outlined within that law and regulation, and if they're not, it's still a good practice to be performing annual pen tests to see where your weaknesses are, to see if you have any open ports. So I won't go into too much more detail on that since we've talked about it quite a bit. But I'd like to know, what is your biggest concern in cybersecurity? Okay. Last up here, just, some key items, right? We talked about social engineering, phishing attempts. They're getting really compelling. And like I said, better to be safe than sorry. If you're not sure and it's legit, someone's going to follow up with you again. Don't click on malicious links. If you don't know who it's coming from, follow your organization security awareness training, and don't click on anything if you have to second guess yourself. Another thing we didn't really talk too much on is passwords, but that's really one of the first lines of defenses. Shouldn't be reusing your passwords, commonly guessed passwords. I know it's difficult to have, 20, 30 different passwords with varying sorts of complexity. It's hard, but you got to try your best. And, really being a part of your security strategy, being proactive is really important, because it is, it's not great when you don't invest in your security budget and then you suffer from a breach and end up having to pay much more than what you would have if you invested early on. I included some frequently asked questions that you all can read through, but I think after we're done with all the presenters, we'll be going into the QA, which we can ask some more. So that's all I got, and I'll be followed by the next presenter.
Come up for a quick intro. 2-for-1 special for the last presenter here. Just first of all, hi everyone. Oh, slide this way?
Up the other way.
Act like you like each other.
Yeah. There you go. Perfect. Good job.
Good. All right, awesome. Hi everyone, I'm Kyle Crosley with the Alair Group. First of all, just wanted to say thank you to Bonadio for hosting this. Great crowd in person and online. And I'm here to introduce Julie Coopers, who is our VP of Clinical. You want to click one.
Sure.
Still works, perfect. Recognizing that we have quite a diverse population here on the call and in front of us here in person, being that there are private schools, there's public schools, there's large colleges, there's small colleges. And when we talk from an insurance standpoint, all those factors matter when we focus in on a specific topic. So what we wanted to do today with the diverse population we have is really talk about, from a clinical perspective, things that are impacting the marketplace, regardless of your employer size or industry. So that's why we wanted to introduce Julie Coopers, who's our VP of Clinical, has a PhD, all sorts of acronyms after her name. It's always good to be sitting next to smarter people than you. So that's my case today. And I'm going to turn it over to her to talk about the specifics of high cost claimant activity and risk volatility overall within population health plans.
Thank you, Kyle.
You got
Kyle
it.
says these PhD things just because he wants to see my cheeks flush. So, but just a little background about me. I am a family nurse practitioner and worked clinically for years in emergency medicine and primary care, and then went back to school to get my PhD in health research and really focused on disease prevention, health promotion, health outcomes. Started at Alera Group now about 4 years ago as the clinical VP. And my role here is really to just dig into all of that clinical and claims information and hopefully provide insights to our employers. So as Kyle said, today we are talking about health plan risk management in higher ed. And I think in order to really talk about risk management, we have to know what are our risks, first of all. So this survey that was done by the National Alliance of Healthcare Purchasers asked employers what they thought were their 3 biggest threats to affordability of their health plan. And the 3 that almost a little more than 8 out of 10 employers mentioned were drug prices, high cost claims, and hospital prices. So we're going to talk about a couple of those today. That first concern that most of the employers had was around drug prices. And drug prices are primarily driven now by specialty medications, which if you're not familiar with that term, those are really high cost medications that manage complex diseases. So these can include things like cancer or inflammatory diseases like rheumatoid arthritis or multiple sclerosis, any of these complex diseases. But they are very expensive. And even though just a very small subset of our population usually takes these specialty medications, so we're talking about less than 2% of our members, they account for over 50% of pharmacy spend now. So on average, these medications cost between $5,000 and $6,000 per month. And last year, the median annual price of a specialty medication was over $250,000 a year. These are medications that are generally ongoing, so we know that they're going to hit our plan and stay on our plan as long as the members are doing well on them. So this, of course, is one concern that we're always monitoring for because we know that this drives so much of our health plan cost. Now, another type of drug, on the second slide here, which is not considered a specialty drug, but has been all over the news. Many of you have probably heard of some of these once we get talking, but this class of drugs is also having a substantial impact on pharmacy costs. And this is called a GLP-1 drug. So we have a little bit of science up here. I won't talk for too long, unless people want to hear more science, but a GLP-1, so what GLP stands for is glucagon-like peptide. That is a hormone that's released in our body every time we eat. So we eat something and this hormone releases some insulin and it controls that blood glucose. So like that delicious cinnamon roll I just ate, this GLP in my body is working, it's controlling that glucose down, giving me more insulin. But for our type 2 diabetics, that hormone, our body does not respond as well to that hormone. So these drugs were created specifically for type 2 diabetics to mimic that hormone in the body so that we could better control our insulin levels. So all of the actions that you see in that little picture, that is what GLP-1s are doing inside our body. They're decreasing our appetite because they're making us feel fuller longer. And they're also slowing down digestion. So they're keeping the food in our stomach and our intestines longer. And because of that, the scientists out there were finding that this was also leading to some weight loss because people were not consuming as many calories because they were feeling fuller longer. And so these medications then were tested in the environment of, could we just use these for weight loss? So the medicines that you see in that category under brand name in the table, the ones that are not bolded, those are the GLP-1 medications solely for diabetes. So we've all probably heard now of Ozempic, maybe Mounjaro. Those medications have become very popular for treating diabetes because they work so well. The ones in the bold, those are medications that are used for solely weight loss. So you can see, like in the case of Ozempic and Wegovy, those are both the same active ingredient. Those are both semaglutide, but one is only approved for diabetes, one is only approved for weight loss. So when they come across on our plans, we see it that way, that maybe we see, oh, we're having this huge spike in GLP-1 medications. And initially, many people attribute that to, we're having a big spike in weight loss. We need to do something about our weight loss medications. But what could actually be happening is we're seeing a big spike in GLP-1s, but it's probably also due to diabetes. So if we look at how we've gotten here over time, so how we treated diabetes in the past, so this was now probably in the 1990s, was generally with a very inexpensive medication called metformin. This is like $5 a month. It's a pill people take. If it didn't work, we would add insulin, and there wasn't a lot of other options. But over time, these drugs were developed, and if you look at that top, the teal graphs there, those are looking at hemoglobin A1C, which is the blood measurement that we use to measure blood glucose over time. So if you look at that, the old medications like metformin, which is all the way on the left there, metformin has about a 1% decrease in someone's hemoglobin A1C. So we want someone's hemoglobin A1C to be less than 7%. That would make them non-diabetic. Some of our diabetics come in though, and their hemoglobin A1C is 10. You give them metformin, yeah, it's going to go down a little bit, but just to 9. So we're not actually moving them into the non-diabetic category. So over time, these medications were developed, and as you can see on the far right, now we have Ozempic and Mounjaro. And these medications are working very well to reduce hemoglobin A1Cs to between 2 and 3% lower. So many of our prescribers now are prescribing these first line, these Ozempic and Mounjaro for diabetes, because they work so much more efficiently than something like metformin, even insulin in some cases. So that's why we're seeing a huge spike in utilization of these medications for diabetics. On the flip side, we are also seeing a spike in use for these similar type medications for weight loss. So the pink charts on the bottom there, that's talking about the drugs now for weight management. So these are still GLP-1s, just used for obesity. So again, you can see over time how these have evolved. So metformin, we were noticing, okay, people were having some weight loss on that. But now with things like Wegovy and Zepbound, we are seeing significant drops in weight. So now up to 21% of body weight in 1 year. That's very significant. So over time, people are still losing weight. Maybe they'll lose 5 to 10 pounds a month, but over a whole year, people are losing such a significant percentage of their body weight that it is impacting them long-term, meaning that it's decreasing their risk of cardiovascular disease, diabetes development, sleep apnea, all of those long-term concerns we have when blood sugar is not controlled or weight is not controlled. So this was just a little blurb about how we got to where we are now, and a little science behind it, because the reason we're even having these conversations around GLP-1s and we're not all out there completely celebrating them because they are working so well is because they're costly. So all of those medications on the far right are about $1,200 per month. So these are medicines people take, they tend to stay on because they're working well. And so when we have 1 out of 8 adults now who have been on a GLP-1 for any length of time, and we know that's only going to increase because of the prevalence of diabetes and obesity in our population, that's a concern financially. So these are about $15,000 per year per member. If you calculate out the 30 to 50% of our population that could be classified as overweight or obese, we could see a huge financial impact ongoing on the plan. So that's why we're having these conversations with employers, because there's a whole spectrum of options from covering them in full with strict prior authorization criteria to deciding that's too much of a risk for our plan, we're not going to cover them at all, and then everything in between. But this is one of those things that is financially a risk to the plan, though I do see these drugs as becoming not only more prevalent, but also for other drugs that are going to be even more efficient than these. So these are all injectable drugs. We're developing right now an oral pill for obesity, which is going to be similarly effective as Zepbound. When that comes out, that's another step in this process. So we'll continue to see these. So before, I just wanted to switch gears actually, before we continue to talk about GLP-1s to our high cost claimants. So remember on that first slide, we saw drug prices. That was the biggest threat to affordability. The second highest threat is these high cost claimants. And these are traditionally defined as members that have had a plan paid amount of over $50,000 in 1 year. Some thresholds could be higher depending on the size of the group, but over $50,000 in a year. And this study that was done by the Kaiser Family Foundation, it showed us that about 5% of our members, so these are our high cost claimants, account for 50% of our plan spend. So if you think about that, we're only talking about a handful of members at times, 10, 20 members. They're accounting for half of our plan spend. So we spend a significant amount of time looking at that subset of the population, just given that impact.
So I like to hear.
Go even further, all the way to the left of that table, the top 1%, so now we're really talking about just a handful of people, are usually accounting for about a quarter of our spend. When we look, polling question. Okay, polling question 8. All right, what are the 3 biggest threats to affordability? Okay, back to high cost claimants. So when we start looking at the high cost claimants in our data, so recently we presented to a large group of our higher education institutions, and we looked at their data over time because anecdotally, when I'm diving into the claims data, I was seeing that it seemed like we were spending more and more on these high cost claimants every year. And in fact, when we look over the past 2-3 years here, if you look at the percent of the population that were high cost claimants in 2021, we're talking about maybe 2% of our population. Now it's 2.6. Medical spend has went up from 42 to 43%. But over these 3 years, you can see pharmacy spend has had a huge jump from 49% to 56%. And total spend, so again, in 2023, these are just 2.6% of our memberships. This is accounting for about 47% of the total spend. You can see on the bottom of some other figures there, just the plan PMPM, obviously increasing year over year, as is the high cost claimant PMPM. So of course, we had to take a deeper look into what was causing this. What are our cost drivers here? So on the bottom chart, you can see that the plan spend, so the highest category with the highest plan spend for high cost claimants was cancer. Probably no surprise to many of us in the room. But when we look at that, we want to know, what about cancer? What is causing these high costs? And so that dark, I'll call it blue, dark blue part of the line, that is attributed to medical cost. The lighter blue or the greenish color is attributed to pharmacy cost. So for cancer in particular, the primary cost driver is medical costs. And that really is due to how we're treating cancer now versus how we were a few decades ago. So early 1950s, let's take breast cancer, for example. We were treating that with surgery, maybe chemo or radiation, and that was really our only option to treat that disease. So that was hitting our plans for 1 year, very high cost, and hopefully outcomes were good and people did well, but unfortunately back then the outcomes were not great. And so science evolved, medicine evolved, and medications were developed to treat certain types of breast cancer. And probably in the last 20 years now, we have targeted therapies and immunotherapies that are targeting certain types of cancer. And in doing so, people are having great outcomes. People are living longer, they are in remission, they are working, they are having a better quality of life. But these medications, and they're generally in the form of infusion drugs that are every few weeks they're given in an outpatient hospital setting, very expensive. These can range from $15,000 per infusion to $50,000 per infusion. And again, this is an every 3-week cost. So those medications, while doing a great job at treating the disease, are accounting for a huge percentage of our high cost claimant spend, especially in medical. Excuse me. The second category there, I'll just talk about the top 2 here, the gastrointestinal diseases. You can see, conversely for that one, the cost driver is that green portion of the bar, and that's specialty medications. So that's where we're seeing a lot of the things that we all see on the commercials. So Humira, Stelara, Enbrel, all of those injectable medications. I won't sing the jingles, but they fall into that category. And those medications too, I told you on average about $5,000 to $6,000 per month, but some of these medications run closer to about $20,000 to $25,000 per month, again, ongoing. So how do we manage these things? We know they're hitting the plan. We know they're accounting for a huge percentage of it. And we all know that it's very difficult for people in general to change their health behaviors. It is more difficult even for clinicians to change patients' health behaviors. And it is probably exceptionally difficult for employers to change health behaviors. So one of the ways in which we help to manage high cost claimants is really by, again, digging into that data and figuring out what are our cost drivers and are there things as employers we can be doing to mitigate those costs. So the first step in doing this is really having access to your data and figuring out what's going on in there. What are we paying for? But data alone is not enough to change outcomes. You also have to have someone that can look at the data and interpret it and figure out, okay, that person is on an infusion drug, but we could maybe move that to a lower costing facility that would be equally as effective for the patient, but would cost the plan half, if not more, less than what they were paying. So we've developed this infrastructure that allows for clinician oversight of all of the high cost claimants. So that involves first identifying these high cost claims. So we've built out several triggers within our data that looks at these high cost claimants every month. And then it has one of our clinical clinicians review those claims. And really we're assessing these things, all of these claims for, first of all, is the treatment appropriate for that condition? Is the cost appropriate for that treatment? Is there any opportunity that we have as employers to optimize care for a patient? And sometimes that could mean, could we talk about maybe moving that site of service for their treatment? And lastly, is the plan operating appropriately? So there's been many instances in which we found that the plan was operating outside of its medical policies. It was approving treatments that it shouldn't have approved or that maybe really required more of a medical director review, but somehow maybe slid through a little bit. So we have set up now these trigger reports to identify any of those issues in real time so that we can manage these risks as soon as they occur on the plan, as opposed to finding out about them a year later in some sort of population health review. So I did just put up one example there. A recent one we found is that one of the members hit our monthly trigger reports because they had a claim spend of over $50,000 in that month. And when we were looking at that, it was a person receiving chemotherapy. But when we looked at the CPT code or the procedure code in the claims data, they actually the plan was getting billed for an ethmoidectomy, which is a surgery to remove our sinuses here in our forehead. But they got billed for that every week for 5 weeks at $27,000. So digging more into that, we of course reached out to the carrier. And that's a big part of what we do is having our clinicians advocate for our employers. Reached out to say, no, this is not appropriate. What is this? And they asserted it was chemo. They were sure of it. So we went back and forth several times, as is per usual. Finally, they looked at it and realized that the claims had been auto-adjudicated, meaning that no human touched them. They just went through their claims system. Yep, okay, surgeries over and over, and just kept getting billed to the plan. So eventually that was corrected, and the plan was refunded, I think about $140,000 for that error, and then going forward, just billed for the chemotherapy that the person should have been receiving. So just really taking an active approach in managing high cost claims, looking at these claims in depth, finding, of course, any sort of abuse or fraudulent claims, and then using that data to help create ongoing strategies to mitigate costs. We found that to be very effective. Any questions at all? Yep. Like, how do the drug prices get set?
Can you repeat the question?
Sure. I think you're saying how do the drug prices get set and how do they get to
Yeah.
such a high level?
Right, yeah.
So much of that's driven by the pharmaceutical industry. So they put out new drugs and these drugs are new in the fact that there's no other treatment sometimes for these disorders. So they can set the prices and there's very little regulation around drug pricing. And then there's very little competition for some of these drugs. So they set it to where they feel it's appropriate. Our PBMs should be helping to negotiate these prices for our plans, but we're still seeing just super high costs.
Okay, thank you, everyone. Thank you for continuing to be patient as we deal with some IT issues. Anyone who's had IT issues with their computer knows that the response from IT is always reboot. So that's what we've been told to do. So we're gonna take a 10-minute break here. Hopefully 10 minutes. We're gonna have IT reboot the system, and then we're gonna come back for the last 20 minutes or so and do a panel Q&A. So for all the people who are online, please submit any questions you have into the chat. And then the people in person will obviously have a chance to ask any more questions that they have as well. And we'll spend a few more minutes with our panelists. No, please do not leave.
Yes.
Please do not leave the meeting. We are going to disappear for a minute, but for the online attendees, please stay. Please stay on.
He's rebooting it. He's rebooting it back there.
I mean,
Yeah.
being in preventive medicine, I always want to try and prevent things from getting worse. Treating diabetes, treating obesity will prevent strokes and cancer. So I can't wait to see over time, like how.
Do we know the long-term effects?
Oh, yeah.
Pandemic,
Yeah.
folks are taking when they're 17.
Right, that's, so everybody's looking at that, like, what's it doing?
And then we left.
We'll go 5 years,
Yes.
so we'll go before it goes up.
Just going to Dublin. We decided spontaneously that we're going to log out. I forget, like Kelly was out of town or something, and
Trying to.
LD was just like on notice. She was like, like, I'm sorry, it just is happening. You're like, I'm not driving, I have no control. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I mean.
At least I still lose money at the logout.
Right, if we can.
Precisely.
No.
I'm still hunched over.
All right, welcome back, everyone. I think we've got our IT issues fixed, so I think everyone online can see us, the whole panel here. So what I'm going to do is open it up for any questions from anyone in the room first, and then if not, I have some questions for the panelists as well. I didn't see any in the chat last time I checked. Yeah. So anyone in the room? Kevin already gone through.
Kristen?
I know, I always have some, but I've used some already.
You've just been doing live questions.
No, live question.
Well, I'll start then, and I'll start with Karen right to my left here. Karen, what happens if GLBA is reported as a finding? What are the repercussions for the school?
So as I had mentioned, this was a big finding over the past few years. So what does happen is it goes into your formal single audit report. You write a corrective action plan, which will require a time frame for when you believe you will be able to get that remediated. But that does go to the Department of Education, and under the fact that GLBA is actually control, I don't know what would be the correct word, governed, guided by the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, believe it or not. With the Department of Education and the FTC, they will contact you. This letter does go to your president. And if they don't like what you're doing or how you're remediating it, they will continue to contact you. They will work with you. And it's more of a opportunity to assist in getting it remediated in what will actually be financially feasible for your institution. So do keep in mind, I think I'd be more concerned, as Brandon mentioned, if you don't have things in place, the cost to put things in place is going to be a lot cheaper than the potential financial impact if something were to happen and you had to contact everybody under the sun about that. So.
And Karen, just a follow-up question there. How often have you seen GLBA be a finding amongst our client base?
With my clients, I would say probably close to 50 or 60% have had some finding or management letter communication of GLBA over the past year. So as I mentioned, it was fairly new compliance requirement in 2023, did not give schools a lot of time to react. So I'm optimistic that this year institutions have had an opportunity now to kind of get a little bit more of those requirements in place.
I'm going to move on.
I have a question for Brandon. In terms of, obviously, we've kind of talked about each institution really having a limited budget. What would be like the one thing you would say as like the most cost effective, kind of easiest to implement thing that you would suggest the institutions kind of do if they haven't already?
Yeah, so working with a limited budget, kind of maybe what your first step should be to kind of help guide or build a more robust cybersecurity posture. And we've talked about it a little bit through the different presentations, but I would highly recommend performing a thorough IT risk assessment, because that is going to identify certain control areas that are not operating or operating as effectively as they should be, which will allow you to focus your time and resources in those areas that need to be remediated. And, if you have 5, 10, 15 findings from a risk assessment, those all don't need to be addressed overnight, right? Those are things that, you can create a roadmap with, and hey, we want to harden our configuration settings in Q1. We want to enhance our antivirus software in Q2. That may be different from some other audit risk assessments, but specific to IT, right? Doing something is better than doing nothing.
And I'll just piggyback on Brandon from a GLBA compliance point is you need to be able to demonstrate that you're aware of what those requirements are and that you're doing something about it. So to Brandon's point, you don't have to do it overnight. You have to have a game plan. You have to acknowledge that you are aware of your responsibility and have, as we said, a game plan, a roadmap, something to show that you're working towards the best compliance that you can for your institution.
I had a question for you on AI, Brandon. For a long time, one of the major risk factors for clients has been receiving emails from the president or their CFO instructing someone to pay a vendor and giving false transaction information, right? And I've been seeing a lot of information in the news lately about voices being spoofed by AI now.
Yep.
And, using that to trying to convince parents that their child is in the hospital or something and to send money immediately. So it seems like that might be the next risk here.
I'm glad you brought this up because I was going to touch on it when I spoke, but I didn't know how long it was going to take me to talk on it. But yeah, no, that is something that's emerging. Kind of when I was going through that AI slide, the enhanced social engineering attacks. When you receive a unsolicited phone call and it's a scam, that's called phishing. And when these threat actors are, enhancing this, what they're often doing is they might, be doing some reconnaissance on you, your friends, and your family. And they might grab a voice snippet from your sister, from your brother, from your coworker, and they can use, the sound of their voice to create, long, compelling messages saying, hey, Brendan, your sister is in the hospital. This is your father. Like, we need money to pay whatever. And it'll sound just like whoever you think it is on the phone. And that's called a deep fake. So you can have deep fake voice messages, and you can also have deep fake video and voice messages.
So what's the next step to prevent that from happening?
It's difficult.
Don't talk to your parents.
So if you get a phone call, oftentimes it'll come up, it'll be they'll spoof their number. So it will look like, the person you're talking to, it'll look like their phone number. If you're not sure, hang up and call the phone number that you have saved in your phone and be like, hey, what's going on? Like, is this actually happening? And, that's one way to check on it. With the videos, it's a little bit harder. They're not perfect. So you can kind of tell if something looks a little bit blurry, or maybe, lettering on a jacket doesn't read what it's really supposed to. So you really got to be analytical and kind of really look to see if this is legit.
So I think what is going to happen at organizations, maybe change some habits, where if it has historically been the case where a president will just call and say, go do this.
Right.
Maybe that's not the best way to do things anymore.
Exactly.
And it has to be a more formalized process. John Miller, we talked about revenue diversification a little bit. Can you talk a little bit more about what strategies institution can use to do that and accomplish it?
Oh boy, that's a tough one. Because actually, I saw Joe yesterday. I guess we're on tour together. And you heard me kind of say, with there's revenue diversification. It's like one of those things. Like, we look like at a Fortune 500 company, or you look like a Johnson & Johnson. They got all these different lines of sales, or even like a Constellation Brands. They got the expensive liquor for the good times, and they got the cheap liquor for the bad times. So they're diversified. So what can a higher ed institution actually do, especially when you look at a lot of what you have is fixed capital? How do you diversify it? Some of the things we've talked about with our higher ed institutions are, you have enrollment's gone down 25%. You have buildings and real estate that aren't being used. And I know it stinks. It almost goes to what Joe said about conflict of interest. You got someone on your board being like, yeah, but that's the dorm I lived in. You really got to look and saying, this portfolio of real estate we have, how are we maximizing use on it? Do we really need excess capacity of 25% here? Or is there something different we can do about it? And there's not going to be any short-term fix in terms of private and public partnerships with this. But we do look and we take other societal things into effect. There's a need for affordable housing. You already have the infrastructure, the sewers, the electric, the internet run. There's a potential there. It's just something that takes 7 years. Other things too, you heard me make a comment as well about, hey, you are higher ed, you got smart people working there. Is there something more? And again, it's hard to shift, but is there more grants we can do? Is there more research and development we can be a part of? Is there a public-private partnership to a problem we can solve that we can participate with, that maybe we can offset some of our administrative costs? We've had our college and universities come to us with a lot of creative ideas. I'm looking at Kristen because she's come to us and we've had talks about UBIT and saying, hey, what are we doing? We're doing more related to that. We are getting more camps. We are using those facilities more, and I'm seeing that across more of our colleges. We're saying, hey, during the slow times, we can cater as well. I would say, great. Take the revenue when you can get it. Just remember, those ideas are not going to solve a 20% enrollment decrease.
So I think the takeaway there is to start selling cheap liquor.
Well, we can't do that anymore, but we do joke around. Joe and I went to Geneseo. Well, Kristen did too. We weren't there, but I do know on campus they did sell at that time. Some of the Bonaventure grads we talked to will say, remember the Rathskeller? I know you could go there and used to be able to drink, but we're not allowed to diversify that much to break the law.
So as part of that, oh, Gene, do you have a question?
No, go ahead, finish this conversation.
Okay, I was just gonna say, as part of that discussion, John, financial forecasting, I've seen that more and more be requested from clients and different organizations that we work with, and like looking at sensitivity analysis and different revenue streams. Can you talk a little bit about how you would suggest going about that process?
So yeah, financial forecasting is the process of saying where are we going to be in the future. And I think it's really important exercise. Sometimes we'll call it multi-year budgeting as well. We have to take what we currently know today and what the trends are. What are the trends with enrollment? What are the trends with operating costs? What are our capital needs? We got to say, where are we going to be with that 5 years from now? And we're having a baseline and we're going to go, we're not going to hit this debt covenant, or heaven forbid, we could run out of cash when you baseline it out. When you get to those situations, your back's up against the wall, you make different decisions. I work with a lot of facilities in another industry that have had their backs up against the wall, and you wouldn't believe how the money comes out of the walls. But at least you use a financial forecast to say, this is the baseline. From there, what you can do is, as Joe said, scenario analysis, what if analysis. What if we increase enrollment, or what if we do this with our discount rate? Will we get more students, less students? What does that look like when we run through the model? Then we start looking at, what if we did just sell off this building? How would we use that cash? Could we take that cash to start another program? How many students would be in that program, operational costs? And you start playing with those levers. And then from those levers, what you do is then you can basically bring that back to your board and you get all strategically aligned. Here's what the operations are. Here's what the financials say. Here's why we're doing it, to protect the mission. And then also that financial forecasting, it's all document you can always go back to and say, you can use that for your monitoring as well. Okay, this is what we said. This is what we said would happen. Why are we not hitting the targets? Where do we need to improve our implementation?
Thanks, John. Gene, did you still have a question?
Yeah, it's a little bit unrelated, but I guess the other side of the coin. We're seeing a lot more schools, unfortunately, that are not continuing. In upstate New York, a lot of unfortunate situations. And I'm wondering what the legal ramifications are and what you're seeing in terms of if there have been an increase in lawsuits and who they're directed towards. I'm just wondering what the legal environment is, what the legal reaction is.
Sure. So just to repeat the question, what are some of the legal ramifications that I have seen with respect to some close downs of higher ed institutions in upstate New York? Tense. The legal ramifications, I'd say, are tense right now. You have usually a pretty dedicated alumni base that want to see this institution continue. You have a board that, depending on the level of engagement, we talked about earlier, may or may not be thinking proactively about how to salvage, what's there, or partner with somebody to sustain themselves. And, a management that's, usually experiencing turnover rapidly. And all of these things are converging and leading to institutions being in a position where, frankly, they don't have a choice. So the ones that are shutting down are just kind of giving up, but they've gotten there because they've run out of options. And I am starting to see lawsuits by students, by alumni, by even infighting amongst boards as to how we got here. And so I think that trend is going to continue as the demographics and higher ed evolves, and smaller liberal arts institutions without huge endowments continue to be challenged. So I don't know how they'll turn out. I know that having early conversations about how we, the institution that may see ourselves in that place 10 years from now, avoid it, and who we can partner with or what we can do to get out in front of it, is a lot better than winding up in that position where you have no choice and now are getting sued left and right. And what are you going to do at that point? You don't have any assets or resources to fight it. So it's just kind of piling on to an already bad situation.
As a follow-up to some of those closures, obviously the board has a fiduciary responsibility to an institution, right?
Yep.
And so what level of personal risk do board members have when it comes to perhaps mismanagement or whatever that leads to a school closing, and what can an institution do to minimize that risk to the members?
Yeah, so I mean, during my presentation, I was talking about those duties. If they are exercising their duty of care, they're being diligent, they're thinking about the institution first and not themselves in any sort of conflict way that doesn't help the institution, that effort and energy counts and will insulate them from losing a lawsuit. It won't stop them from getting sued. But that's what the D&O insurance coverage is for, which will defend them. And as long as, they have tried things, look, businesses fail, institutions fail, enterprises fail. As long as you're not ignorant of the circumstances and, or purposefully ignorant of the circumstances as it's going down the tubes, and trying things, I think ultimately you'll be successful in defending yourselves in that lawsuit. It'll be unpleasant, but you'll have resources for the D&O insurance, protection by the law, and I think you'll come out okay, but it won't be a pleasant experience, that's for sure.
Is there a risk for having a low attendance rate at your board or committee meetings? I think
yes.
Pre-pandemic, I think 2 or 3 times a year everyone would gather in person.
Yeah.
And nowadays I see a lot more virtual meetings where people don't show or just have their camera off and don't say anything.
Yeah, if I'm the plaintiff's lawyer, I'm going to introduce the board minutes. I'm going to subpoena them. I'm going to get the board minutes, and I'm going to look at the attendance, and I'm going to say a third of your board hasn't attended in the last 3 years. How can you justifiably say to me you've been exercising your collective fiduciary duty of care when a third of your board hasn't showed up? So yes, it matters.
With that, I'd be curious to see the poll results on Joe's question about the board level. I looked at a lot of those questions that come to the common theme of engagement, and how do you continue to engage your board during these times? Now we found we could just attend via video, and we don't have to turn the camera on. Does that mean I'm there? Does that mean I'm engaged? And you're opening yourself up to risk. I actually was talking to a client this week. It is kind of going around larger clients, not saying you necessarily, but we're seeing nonprofits starting to actually compensate their boards. And so I called one that I knew did it and said, how do you do this? And they structure it by a level of activity. You're on a committee, you plan the agenda, you show up at the board meeting. And she said, behind the scenes, what we have is the board portal. And we can actually tell when you logged in and how long you spent in there and how much you looked up. We haven't enforced that, but we might, because of where we are in our financial position. We're very precarious. We need you showing up and we need you participating. And I go back to what Joe just said and said, you might need that to protect yourself down the road. When did you open up when did you open it up, and how long did you look at it before the meeting?
We are almost out of time, but I want to make sure I Julie Kyle over here as well. So one last question, and then we'll see if anyone in the audience has anything. But higher education tends to have an older demographic when it comes to the employee population, right? With professors, how does that impact the type of analysis?
Yeah, I'll start. I think to your point, it's true, right? Higher education tends to have an older population. So the question essentially is, does that translate into higher claims activity? And as it turns out, after looking in the data, there's a couple factors. Number one, the turnover rate at higher education institutions compared to education at large is substantially less. It's about 13% turnover year over year. So while that's a good thing, it also means that the population will age as time goes on. Generally speaking, yes, the older you are, the more at risk you are for adverse claims. But as it turns out, in higher education specifically, again, compared to other industries and education at large, the socioeconomics behind staff and faculty tend to outperform those of other industries. So things like wellness, preventative care checkups, things of that nature, the compliance rates associated with those types of activities are higher, which in turn helps prevent those longer, higher cost claimant activities. Obviously, you can't prevent them all, but overall, the socioeconomics, even in an aging population, potentially compared to other industries, is better than expected from an age perspective. Anything to add to that, Julie?
The one thing I add is just taking into account that the turnover rate is so low, that may inform some of the strategies that we want to implement in these groups. So if we know that our folks are going to stay with us for 20 plus years, we might want to invest more in something, not to harp on the GLP-1s, but something like that early on to prevent those long-term complications, because we know our employees are generally with us for a long time.
That's a very interesting point, because from talking with people who have personally paid for the GLP-1 drugs out of pocket, because generally it seems like insurance hasn't covered it. So that's an interesting point that in some situations it may not. Well, thank you for everyone for attending both in person and online today. We appreciate everything that you do for us and with us. We will be in touch again soon for the next breakfast series in the fall sometime.